The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Verdi, Nevada, causing Josephine Bennett to drop the pile of laundry she'd been carrying from Mrs. Wilson's boarding house. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she scrambled to collect the scattered linens, knowing her father's debts were coming due today, and by the sound of that gunshot, something had gone terribly wrong. Verdi in 1876 was no place for a woman alone, especially not a woman whose father had gambled away everything they owned and then some. Thomas Bennett had been a charming man with a weakness for whiskey, women, and worst of all, cards. When consumption took him 3 weeks ago, Josephine discovered the true extent of his debts and the names of the 4 men to whom he owed significant sums. She hurried down the main street, the late afternoon sun beating down on her uncovered head. Her bonnet hung forgotten around her neck as she clutched the laundry basket to her chest. The town's lone saloon, the Silver Dollar, seemed to be the source of the commotion. A crowd had gathered outside, and Josephine pushed her way through, dread pooling in her stomach. "Papa," she whispered, though she knew he was long buried on the dusty hill overlooking town. 4 men stood in a loose semicircle inside the saloon. She recognized them all: Vernon Stokes, the saloon owner; Emmett Walsh, the banker; Howard Pike, a cattle baron who owned half the grazing land outside town; and Silas Thornton, a ruthless loan shark who'd come to Verdi on the railroad and never left. In the center of their circle lay the crumpled form of Mr. Peterson, the town's aging lawyer who had been helping Josephine sort through her father's affairs. "Miss Bennett," Stokes said, his voice oily as his mustache-covered lips curved into what might have been a smile. "We were just discussing your father's outstanding obligations." Josephine gripped the basket tighter. Mr. Peterson was handling those matters. Walsh chuckled, a cold sound that raised goosebumps on her arms despite the Nevada heat. "Mr. Peterson seems to have retired from the case." The smoking gun in his hand told the true story. "You killed him," Josephine whispered, backing toward the door. "He interfered in business that wasn't his concern," Pike said, adjusting his expensive vest. "Much like you're doing now." Thornton, the smallest but most dangerous of the 4, stepped forward. "Your father owed each of us substantial sums, Miss Bennett. In total, more than $2,000. The amount made her dizzy. She earned 50 cents a day doing laundry and mending. At that rate, it would take her more than a decade to pay off such a sum. "I don't have that kind of money," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're aware," Stokes replied, "which is why we've come to an alternate arrangement." The way the 4 men looked at her made her skin crawl. Josephine was 22 and not unaware of her appearance. Her chestnut hair and green eyes had drawn attention before, unwanted though it was. "What arrangement?" she asked, though she feared she already knew. "Your companionship," Walsh said bluntly. "Each of us has a claim on you. 1 week per month, rotating between us until we consider the debt settled." Horror washed over her. That's indecent, immoral. "I can't." "You don't have a choice," Pike cut in. "Your father signed papers before he died. You're collateral." "That's not possible," she protested. "A person can't be. A woman isn't property under the law, but a debt is a debt," Thornton said, his voice cold. "And we've bought the mortgage on your little house, too. You've nowhere to go, Miss Bennett." The saloon had gone quiet, the regulars at the bar studiously avoiding looking in their direction. No one would help her. No one dared cross these 4 men who effectively owned Verdi. "I need time to think," she said, backing toward the door. "You have until sundown tomorrow," Stokes said. "Then we draw lots for who gets you first." Josephine fled, tears blurring her vision as she ran down the dusty street, still clutching her laundry basket. She didn't see the rider until she collided with his horse, bouncing off the animal's shoulder and landing hard in the dirt. "Whoa there!" a deep voice called as strong hands helped her to her feet. "You all right, madam?" She looked up into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a worn Stetson. The stranger was tall and broad-shouldered, his clothes dusty from the trail but of good quality. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, gathering the scattered laundry. "I wasn't looking where I was going." "No harm done," he said, helping her collect the garments, "though you seem in an almighty hurry." Her voice caught as she glanced back toward the saloon. The four men had emerged onto the boardwalk and were watching her. The stranger followed her gaze, his expression hardening as he took in the tableau. "Those men troubling you?" "It's nothing I can't handle," she said automatically, though it was a lie. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing her. "Name's Jacob Morgan," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Just rode in from California." "Josephine Bennett," she replied, briefly shaking his hand before clutching the basket again. "Well, Miss Bennett, would you mind pointing me toward the nearest hotel? I could use a bath and a meal that isn't my own cooking." She pointed toward Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, the very place she'd been running from when the gunshot rang out. "Mrs. Wilson has rooms. It's just down the street. She serves supper at 6. Jacob Morgan nodded, his eyes still on the four men watching them. "Much obliged. Perhaps I'll see you there." Josephine hurried away, feeling the weight of 8 eyes on her back, the four men who claimed to own her, and the stranger who had appeared from nowhere like some avenging angel. She didn't dare hope he might help her, though. No one in Verdi had stood up to those men before. When she delivered the laundry to Mrs. Wilson, the older woman took one look at her tear-streaked face and ushered her into the kitchen. "What's happened, child?" she asked, pressing a cup of strong tea into Josephine's trembling hands. "They killed Mr. Peterson," she whispered. "They say I belong to them now, to pay Papa's debts." Mrs. Wilson's normally cheerful face hardened. "Those devils. I've heard rumors about their dealings, but this—" She shook her head. "What will you do?" "What can I do? They own my house. They'll throw me out if I don't comply." Josephine's voice broke. "But I can't. I won't." "Of course you won't," Mrs. Wilson said firmly. "We'll think of something." But by the time Josephine left to return to her small house on the edge of town, neither of them had come up with a solution. She was halfway home when she realized she was being followed. Turning quickly, she prepared to confront one of her tormentors, but instead found Jacob Morgan a few paces behind her. "Mr. Morgan," she said, startled. "Why are you following me?" "Making sure you get home safe," he said simply. "This doesn't seem like the kind of town where a lady should walk alone, especially not with the welcome committee you've got." Despite everything, she found herself smiling at his description of the four men. "They're powerful here. You shouldn't get involved." Jacob fell into step beside her. "I've never been one for taking advice on what I should or shouldn't do, Miss Bennett. Seems to me those men are up to no good, and I've always had a problem with bullies." "They're more than bullies," she said quietly. "They own half the town between them. My father owed them money, and now that he's gone, they've decided I'm to pay his debt with myself." Jacob's expression darkened. "That's so. Well, that's not right by any stretch. A debt's a debt, but a person isn't property." They had reached her small house, a wooden structure that had seen better days but was clean and solidly built. Josephine hesitated at the gate. "Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Morgan, but please, for your own safety, stay clear of those men." He tipped his hat to her. "I'll consider your advice, Miss Bennett, but I make no promises." His blue eyes were serious as he added, "Lock your doors tonight. I'll come by in the morning." Before she could respond, he turned and walked back toward town, his stride purposeful. Josephine watched him go, a tiny spark of hope flickering to life in her chest. That night, she slept fitfully, waking at every creak and groan of the old house. When dawn finally broke, she rose and dressed in her best and only good dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the green of her eyes. If this was to be her last day of freedom, she would face it with dignity. She had just finished pinning up her hair when a knock sounded at her door. Her heart leapt into her throat, but when she peered through the window, it was Jacob Morgan standing on her porch, hat in hand. "Mr. Morgan," she said, opening the door, "I didn't expect you so early." "Thought we might have breakfast," he said, "and discuss your situation." She hesitated. "There's nothing to discuss. Unless you have $2,000 to spare, I don't see a way out." "Let's talk anyway," he insisted. "Mrs. Wilson makes a fine breakfast, according to the other boarders." Despite herself, Josephine found she was hungry, and the thought of facing the morning alone was unbearable. "Very well," she agreed, reaching for her shawl. They walked to the boarding house in companionable silence, the early morning light turning the dusty streets of Verdi golden. "Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened when she saw them together, but she said nothing, merely showing them to a small table in the corner of the dining room, over plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Jacob Morgan outlined a plan so audacious that Josephine nearly choked on her coffee. "You want to what?" she gasped. "Challenge them," he repeated calmly. "Each of them to poker. If I win, your debt is cleared. If they win—" He shrugged. "Well, they won't." "You can't be serious," she said. "Those men are professional gamblers, especially Stokes. They'll clean you out." Jacob's mouth curved in a small smile. "I've played a hand or two in my time, Miss Bennett, and I've got enough to cover your father's debt if it comes to that." "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, bewildered. "You don't even know me." His expression softened. "Let's just say I have a particular dislike for men who treat women as property. And," he added with a wink, "I've been looking for some excitement." "You'll get yourself killed," she warned. "I don't think so," he replied, his confidence unshaken. "Now tell me about these four. What makes them tick? What are their weaknesses?" For the next hour, Josephine detailed what she knew about each man. Vernon Stokes, the saloon owner, was greedy and quick to anger but calculated in his cruelty. Emmett Walsh, the banker, presented himself as respectable but had a wandering eye and loose morals. Howard Pike, the cattle baron, was proud to a fault and accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. And Silas Thornton, the loan shark, was coldly logical, patient, and utterly without mercy. "Interesting bunch," Jacob commented when she finished. "And you say they'll be at the saloon at noon to hear your decision?" She nodded, her stomach knotting at the thought. "Yes, they expect me to choose one of them first." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Well, they're in for a surprise." He stood, dropping coins on the table for their breakfast. "I have some preparations to make. Meet me in front of the saloon at noon." "Mr. Morgan," she began. "Jacob," he corrected with a smile. "If I'm going to risk my neck for you today, you might as well use my Christian name." "Jacob," she said softly, "please be careful. I couldn't bear it if another person died because of my father's debts." He took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Trust me, Josephine. By sunset, you'll be a free woman." As he strode away, Josephine found herself watching him go with a mixture of fear and something else, a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope, yes, but also the stirrings of something that felt dangerously like affection. The hours until noon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Josephine tried to occupy herself with mending, but her hands shook too badly to thread the needle. She paced her small house, alternating between praying for Jacob's success and cursing him for a fool. At 11:45, she donned her bonnet, squared her shoulders, and began the walk to the Silver Dollar Saloon. The streets seemed quieter than usual, as if the town itself were holding its breath. News of Mr. Peterson's murder had spread, along with rumors about the four men's plans for Thomas Bennett's daughter. Jacob was waiting for her as promised, leaning against a hitching post outside the saloon. He'd changed into a clean white shirt and dark vest, and his gun belt was polished, the revolver seated securely in its holster. He looked, she thought with a catch in her breath, like a man prepared for anything. "Ready?" he asked quietly as she approached. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "And whatever happens, remember you are not property. You're free to choose your own path." With that, he offered his arm, which she took with trembling fingers, and together they pushed through the batwing doors into the saloon. The four men were already there, seated around a table in the center of the room. They looked up as Jacob and Josephine entered, surprise flashing across their faces before hardening into hostility. "Miss Bennett," Stokes said, rising from his chair. "I see you've brought a friend." "More than a friend," Jacob said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "I'm her advocate, and I understand you gentlemen believe you have some claim on this lady," Walsh snorted. "Her father's debts are legal and binding. She's the only asset he left behind." "A person isn't property," Jacob stated firmly, echoing his words from the day before. "She's free to make her own choices, and she chooses not to honor these so-called obligations." Pike stood, his hand moving toward his gun. "And who might you be to interfere in our business?" "Jacob Morgan," he said simply. "And I'm proposing a solution that might satisfy everyone." Thornton, ever the businessman, leaned forward. "We're listening." "A game," Jacob said, pulling out a deck of cards from his vest pocket. "Poker. 5-card stud. I play each of you in turn. If I win, you tear up Miss Bennett's father's debt. If you win, I'll pay the amount in full in cash." The four men exchanged glances. "And if we refuse?" Stokes asked. Jacob's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then things get complicated. The sheriff in Carson City might be interested to hear about Mr. Peterson's unfortunate accident yesterday. And I believe there's a federal marshal passing through who has a particular interest in loan sharks operating across state lines." This last was directed at Thornton, who paled visibly. "You're bluffing," Walsh said, but he sounded uncertain. "Perhaps," Jacob agreed amiably. "But are you willing to risk it? A poker game seems simpler all around." There was a long moment of tension before Stokes laughed, the sound lacking any humor. "You've got guts, Morgan, I'll give you that. Very well, we accept your challenge." "Excellent," Jacob said, pulling out a chair for Josephine before seating himself across from Stokes. $500 a hand, I believe, was the amount each man is owed." Pike frowned. "How did you know the exact figure?" Jacob spread his hands innocently. "Lucky guess. Shall we begin?" The first game, against Stokes, was tense. The saloon owner was indeed skilled, his face revealing nothing as he played. Josephine watched, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white, as the two men matched each other bet for bet. When the final card was dealt, Jacob had 3 kings showing. Stokes had a possible straight. The betting grew heated, the pile of coins and bills in the center of the table mounting. "Call," Jacob said finally. Stokes laid down his cards with a triumphant smile. "Straight 9 high." Jacob nodded appreciatively, then turned over his whole card. "Full house, kings over 2s." The room erupted in murmurs as Stokes's face darkened with anger. "You cheated," he spat. "Did I?" Jacob asked mildly. "Feel free to examine the deck. Or perhaps one of your friends would like to deal the next hand." Walsh volunteered, his banker's fingers nimble as he shuffled the cards. The second game proceeded much like the first, with Jacob eventually revealing a flush that beat Walsh's 2 pair. By the time Jacob faced Pike for the third game, The cattle baron was visibly nervous. His tells were obvious to everyone, watching: a slight twitch of his left eye when he bluffed, a tap of his finger when he had a good hand. Jacob took advantage mercilessly, winning with a straight to Pike's 3 of a kind. Only Thornton remained, cold and calculating as he took the dealer's chair. The lone shark played defensively, folding early on several hands rather than risk large losses. But Jacob was patient, gradually wearing him down until, on the 7th hand, Thornton finally overcommitted with a pair of aces showing. "Raise you 200, Thornton said, pushing forward a stack of gold coins. Jacob matched it without hesitation. "Call." Thornton's smile was reptilian as he turned over his whole cards: another ace and a king. "3 of a kind," he announced. Jacob nodded, then slowly revealed his own hidden cards: the 4th ace and a 10. "3 aces as well," he said, "but my kicker's higher." The room went completely still as Thornton stared at the cards, then at Jacob. "Impossible," he whispered. "Just fortunate," Jacob replied, gathering the substantial pot. Then, looking each man in the eye, he added, "I believe our business is concluded. Miss Bennett's father's debts are considered paid in full." "Now wait just a minute," Stokes began, half rising from his chair. "Is there a problem?" Jacob asked, his hand moving casually toward his holster. The 4 men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Thornton who finally spoke. "No problem," he said carefully. "A deal's a deal. The debts are cleared." "I'll need that in writing," Jacob said. "All 4 of you, and I want the deed to Miss Bennett's house transferred back to her name." Walsh frowned. "That's not part of our agreement." "Consider it interest," Jacob replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. After a tense moment, Walsh nodded. "Fine. I'll draw up the papers this afternoon." "We'll wait," Jacob said pleasantly. "No time like the present." Under Jacob's watchful eye, all 4 men signed documents relinquishing their claims on Josephine and her property. When the last signature was dry, Jacob gathered the papers and handed them to Josephine. "As I said," he told her, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're free." Tears pricked her eyes as she accepted the documents. "Thank you," she whispered. As they turned to leave the saloon, Stokes called out, "This isn't over, Morgan. Verdi's a small town. Accidents happen." Jacob paused, then turned back slowly. "Is that a threat, Mr. Stokes?" "Just an observation," the saloon owner replied, but his eyes were cold. "Then let me make an observation of my own," Jacob said. "I don't take kindly to threats, veiled or otherwise, and unlike Miss Bennett's father, I'm quite capable of defending myself and those under my protection." His hand rested casually on his revolver. "Do we understand each other?" Stokes's gaze flickered to Jacob's holster, then back to his face. Whatever he saw there made him swallow hard. "Perfectly," he said. Outside in the bright afternoon sunlight, Josephine let out a shuddering breath. "I can't believe you did that," she said. "You could have been killed." Jacob smiled, the tension leaving his shoulders as they walked away from the saloon. "I had the situation well in hand. They'll come after you," she warned. "They won't let this insult stand." "Let them try," he said, unconcerned. "But I suspect they value their skins too much to risk it." Changing the subject, he added, "Now, I believe we should celebrate your newfound freedom. Dinner at Mrs. Wilson's, perhaps." The idea of celebrating seemed surreal after the ordeal she'd been through, but Josephine found herself nodding. "Yes, I'd like that." As they walked toward the boarding house, Jacob offered her his arm again, and she took it, acutely aware of his strength and the warmth of his body next to hers. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Mrs. Wilson was delighted to host them for a private dinner in her small parlor, laying out her best china and cooking a special meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh baked bread. Over dinner, Jacob told Josephine more about himself, how he'd grown up in California, the son of a successful rancher, how he'd fought briefly in the war before returning west, how he'd made his own fortune in the gold fields and then through smart investments in land and cattle. "What brings you to Verdi?" Josephine asked as they lingered over apple pie. "It's hardly on the way to anywhere." Jacob's expression grew more serious. "Truth be told, I was looking for someone, a man named Thomas Bennett." Josephine nearly dropped her fork. "My father." "Why would you be looking for him?" Jacob hesitated before answering. "He and my father were partners once in a mining venture near Sacramento. When the mine failed, your father disappeared with what was left of the investment money. My father never recovered financially or emotionally. He died believing himself a failure." "I'm so sorry," Josephine said, genuine remorse in her voice. "I had no idea. My father never mentioned a partner." "I'm not surprised," Jacob said. "I've been tracking him for years, hoping to recover something of what he took. When I finally found a lead that he'd settled in Verdi, I came as quickly as I could." "Only to discover he was already dead," Josephine finished softly. "And instead of a thief, you found his desperate daughter." Jacob's eyes were kind as he reached across the table to take her hand. "I found a brave, honorable woman who was willing to sacrifice herself to pay her father's debts. That tells me more about you than your father's actions ever could." "But you still lost what you came for," she pointed out. "Did I?" he asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I came seeking justice, or perhaps revenge. Instead, I found something I didn't know I was looking for." The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "And what was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A chance to right a wrong," he said, "and perhaps a new beginning." The way he looked at her sent a warm shiver down her spine. It was too soon, she knew, to feel this way about a man she'd just met. And yet there was something between them, a connection, a spark that had ignited the moment they collided on the dusty street. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Shouts echoed from the direction of the main street, followed by the sound of running feet and, most alarming, gunshots. Jacob was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Stay here," he told Josephine, drawing his revolver. "What is it?" she asked, fear clutching at her heart. Before he could answer, Mrs. Wilson burst into the room, her face ashen. "Fire!" she cried. "The silver dollar's ablaze and it's spreading to the buildings next door," Jacob cursed under his breath. "Those fools," he muttered. "They'll burn the whole town down." To Josephine, he said, "Stay with Mrs. Wilson. I'm going to help with the bucket line." "Be careful," she pleaded as he strode toward the door. "Always," he promised with a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Wilson turned to Josephine, her expression grim. "I don't think this fire is an accident, child, not after what happened at the saloon today." Josephine's blood ran cold. "You think they set it deliberately?" "I wouldn't put it past them," the older woman replied. "And I fear it's only the beginning." Fear for Jacob propelled Josephine to her feet. "I have to warn him. They might be using the fire as a distraction." "You can't go out there," Mrs. Wilson protested. "It's too dangerous." But Josephine was already heading for the door, her mind made up. "I won't let another person die because of me," she said firmly. The scene on the main street was chaos. The silver dollar was fully engulfed in flames, and the fire had indeed spread to the adjoining buildings. Men formed bucket brigades from the town's 2 wells, passing water hand to combat the blaze. Women and children huddled at a safe distance, watching in horror as their town burned. Josephine searched the crowd desperately for Jacob, finally spotting him in the thick of the bucket line, his white shirt soaked with sweat and water, his face streaked with soot. She started toward him, but a hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "Hello, Miss Bennett," Silas Thornton said, his grip painfully tight. "Your cowboy friend seems preoccupied. Perfect time for us to have a chat." "Let me go," she demanded, trying to pull away. "I don't think so," he replied, dragging her toward an alley between two buildings. "Your friend embarrassed us today. That can't go unpunished." "The fire," she gasped as realization dawned. "You started it." Thornton's smile was cold. "A regrettable accident, much like the one your friend Morgan is about to have." Panic surged through her. "What do you mean?" "Stokes and Pike are taking care of him as we speak," Thornton said. "Walsh is waiting with horses at the edge of town. Once Morgan is dealt with, you'll be coming with us after all." "I'll scream," she threatened. "No one will hear you over the commotion," he said confidently. "And even if they did, no one will interfere. Not after what happened to Peterson." Josephine knew he was right. The townspeople were too frightened of these men to help her. She had only herself to rely on. As Thornton dragged her deeper into the alley, away from the crowd, she remembered something her father had once told her. When a man thinks he's won, that's when he's most vulnerable. With sudden clarity, she stopped resisting and instead stumbled forward as if tripping. Thornton, surprised by the change, loosened his grip momentarily. It was all the opening she needed. Spinning around, she brought her knee up hard between his legs. Thornton doubled over with a strangled cry, releasing her arm. Josephine didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, not back toward the crowded street where Thornton might easily recapture her, but deeper into the alley, heading for the back streets of Verdi. Behind her, she could hear Thornton cursing as he recovered, his footsteps echoing as he gave chase. She hiked up her skirts and ran faster, turning corners at random, trying to lose him in the maze of back alleys and service lanes that ran behind Verdi's main buildings. Her lungs burned and her side ached, but fear drove her onward. She had to get back to the main street to find Jacob before Stokes and Pike could harm him. But first, she needed to lose Thornton. She ducked behind a stack of crates, pressing herself against the rough wooden wall of what she thought was the general store. Holding her breath, she listened as Thornton's footsteps slowed, then stopped not far away. "I know you're here, Miss Bennett," he called, his voice eerily calm despite what she'd done to him. "You're only making things worse for yourself. Come out now and I'll make sure you're treated." Gently. The way he said the last word made her skin crawl. She remained perfectly still, not daring to move a muscle. "Have it your way," Thornton continued after a moment of silence. "But remember, we have your cowboy friend. If you want him to live, you'll surrender yourself." It was a lie, she told herself. It had to be. They couldn't have gotten to Jacob that quickly. But doubt gnawed at her. What if they had? What if he was injured or worse while she hid like a coward? The sound of a scuffle nearby made her decision for her. There were shouts, the thud of fists meeting flesh, and then a gunshot that made her jump. Before she could think better of it, she peered around the edge of the crates. In the dim light of the alley, she could make out 3 figures. One was Thornton, backing away with his hands raised. The second was Vernon Stokes, sprawled motionless on the ground. And the third, advancing with a revolver trained steadily on Thornton, was Jacob. "Jacob!" she cried, relief flooding through her. He didn't take his eyes off Thornton, but his voice was warm as he replied. "Stay back, Josephine. This isn't over yet." "Where's Pike?" she asked, scanning the alley. "Taking a nap in a horse trough," Jacob answered grimly. "And Walsh is tied up in the livery stable. Now it's just Mr. Thornton here who needs to decide if he wants to join his friend Stokes." For the first time, Josephine noticed the dark stain spreading across Stokes's chest. Her hand flew to her mouth. "You killed him." "He didn't give me much choice," Jacob said. "He had a knife." Thornton's eyes darted between Jacob and Josephine, calculating. "This changes nothing," he said. "You can't kill all of us and expect to walk away. There'll be questions." "You're right," Jacob agreed. "Which is why you're going to leave town, tonight. All three of you who are still breathing, and you're never coming back." Thornton laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet alley. "You can't force us out. We own this town." "Not anymore," Jacob said. "While you were chasing Miss Bennett, I had a few words with some of the townspeople. Seems they've been waiting for someone to stand up to you for. Once I explained how you started the fire that's destroying their homes and businesses, well," he shrugged. "Let's just say there's a crowd forming that's not feeling too kindly toward you gentlemen." As if to confirm his words, voices could be heard approaching, angry voices, calling Thornton's name. "You're bluffing," Thornton said, but there was fear in his eyes now. "Am I?" Jacob asked. "Want to stay and find out?" For a long moment, Thornton stood frozen, weighing his options. Then, with a curse, he turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness at the far end of the alley. Jacob watched him go, then holstered his revolver and turned to Josephine. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle as he reached for her. She shook her head, then flung herself into his arms. "I was so worried," she admitted against his chest. "Thornton said they were going to kill you." His arms tightened around her. "It'll take more than those three to get the best of me," he assured her. "But we should go. The fire's mostly under control now, but there'll be questions about Stokes. Better if we're not found here." Hand in hand, they made their way back to the main street, where the bucket brigade had indeed gained the upper hand against the flames. The silver dollar was a total loss, but the surrounding buildings had been saved, though with significant damage. In the chaotic aftermath, with everyone focused on securing what could be salvaged from the damaged structures, no one paid much attention to Jacob and Josephine as they slipped away to her small house. Once inside, with the door locked behind them, Josephine finally allowed herself to relax. "What happens now?" she asked, sinking into a chair at her kitchen table. Jacob sat across from her, running a hand through his soot-streaked hair. "Pike and Walsh will likely collect Thornton and leave town if they haven't already. As for Stokes," he sighed. "That was self-defense, but there might still be trouble with the law. I'd rather not be here when his body is found." Her heart sank. "You're leaving, then?" "I'm suggesting we both leave," he said, his gaze steady on her face. "Tonight. I have a ranch outside of Sacramento. It's a good place. Peaceful." "You're asking me to go with you," she clarified, hardly daring to believe it. Jacob reached across the table to take her hands in his. "I know it's sudden. We've only just met. But sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of time for proper courtship. I feel something for you, Josephine, something I've never felt before, and I hope you might feel it too." The warmth in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "I do," she admitted softly. "But Jacob, you've already done so much for me. You risked your life, killed a man." "I'd do it again in a heartbeat," he said simply. "Not because I expect anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Because from the moment I saw you running down that street, something in me recognized something in you, like we were meant to find each other." It was romantic foolishness, the kind of thing her practical mind would normally dismiss. And yet, hadn't she felt that same inexplicable connection? That sense that this man, this stranger who had appeared when she needed him most, was somehow meant to be part of her life. "What would I do at your ranch?" she asked, her mind turning to practical matters. His smile was warm. "Whatever you want. Read books, plant a garden, learn to ride. I've got a good library that could use organizing, and my cook would welcome help with the menus. Or you could just rest and heal from everything you've been through." He paused, then added more softly, "And perhaps in time, if your feelings grow as I hope they will, you might consider becoming my wife." The proposal, tentative though it was, sent a flutter through her chest. You make it sound so simple. It can be, he said, if we want it to be. Looking into his eyes, Josephine found herself believing him. After the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, the idea of starting fresh in a new place with this man who had risked everything to save her was powerfully appealing. Yes, she said finally. I'll go with you. His face lit up with a smile that transformed his rugged features. You won't regret it, he promised. Now pack what you can carry. We'll leave within the hour. I've got horses waiting at the livery stable. As Josephine gathered her few precious possessions, her mother's locket, her father's Bible, despite everything, she couldn't leave it behind. A few clothes and personal items, she marveled at the strange turn her life had taken. Yesterday, she had been facing a future of indentured servitude to 4 of the vilest men she'd ever met. Tonight, she was fleeing town with a virtual stranger who had saved her life and possibly stolen her heart. It was madness, surely. And yet, as she closed her small carpetbag and took one last look around the house that had been her home, she felt not fear but exhilaration. Jacob was waiting for her on the porch, 2 saddled horses tethered to the rail. He had changed into clean clothes and washed the soot from his face, though a dark bruise was forming along his jawline where someone Pike, she guessed, had managed to land a blow. "Ready?" he asked, taking her bag and securing it to one of the saddles. She nodded, stepping out and pulling the door closed behind her. She didn't bother to lock it. She wouldn't be coming back. Jacob helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Then he swung up onto his own horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that dwarfed her more modest mare. "We'll ride through the night," he told her as they set off at a steady pace. "There's a way station about 20 miles west where we can rest for a few hours tomorrow, then on to Carson City, where we can catch the train part of the way. With luck, we'll be at the ranch in 3 days." Josephine looked back once as they crested the small rise outside of town. Verdi lay behind them, the smoldering remains of the silver dollar still visible in the moonlight. Despite everything that had happened there, she felt a pang of sadness at leaving. It had been her home, after all. "Having second thoughts?" Jacob asked, noticing her backward glance. She shook her head. "No, just saying goodbye." He reached across the space between their horses to squeeze her hand. "It's always hard leaving a place, even one with bad memories, but we're heading toward something better." "How can you be so sure?" she asked. His smile was visible even in the darkness. "Because we're going together." The journey to Jacob's ranch was arduous but uneventful. They rode hard the first night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Verdi. By dawn, they were both exhausted, but Jacob insisted they press on to the way station he'd mentioned. There, they rested for a few hours, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Jacob was taking no chances that Pike, Walsh, or Thornton might have followed them. But there was no sign of pursuit, and by mid-afternoon, they were on the road again. They reached Carson City late the following day, where they sold the horses and purchased tickets for the train that would take them part of the way to Sacramento. The remainder of the journey would be by stagecoach. On the train, seated side by side in the relative privacy of their compartment, Josephine finally had time to reflect on the whirlwind of events that had brought her here. "Tell me more about your ranch," she said, watching the landscape roll by outside the window. Jacob's face softened with obvious pride. "It's not the biggest spread in California, but it's good land. About 2,000 acres, most of it grazing for cattle, but there's an orchard too and fields for hay and grain. The house isn't fancy, my father built it with his own hands, but it's solid and comfortable." "And you run it all yourself?" she asked, impressed. "I have help," he said. "A foreman, Miguel Ramirez, who's been with us since I was a boy. His wife, Elena, keeps house. There are about a dozen hands, good men who have been with me for years. And then there's Mrs. Abernathy, the cook, who thinks it's her personal mission to fatten me up." He chuckled at this. "You'll like her. She's been saying for years that what the place needs is a woman's touch." The casual way he included her in his future made Josephine's heart skip. "I don't know the first thing about being a rancher's wife," she admitted. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "There's no hurry. As I said, you can take all the time you need to settle in, to be sure this is what you want." She looked down at their joined hands, then up into his blue eyes. "And if I already know it's what I want," his gaze darkened, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. But they were interrupted by the conductor's call announcing the next station. Jacob cleared his throat, releasing her hand reluctantly. "We should prepare to change for the stagecoach," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "The next part of the journey isn't as comfortable as this." He was right. The stagecoach was cramped and dusty, jolting over rough roads that made conversation difficult. They were wedged in with 4 other passengers, a mother with 2 small children and an elderly gentleman who slept most of the way. But even in these uncomfortable circumstances, Josephine found herself stealing glances at Jacob, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck, the gentleness with which he helped the harried mother with her squirming children. By the time they reached the final stop before Jacob's ranch, a small town called Oak Ridge, Josephine was sore, exhausted, and more certain than ever that she had made the right decision in coming with him. Jacob hired a wagon to take them the remaining 10 miles to the ranch. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with oak trees. Cattle grazed in verdant pastures, and in the distance, she could make out the silhouette of mountains against the sky. "It's beautiful," she said, drinking in the scene. Jacob smiled, one arm around her shoulders to steady her on the rough wagon seat. "Wait until you see the house." They crested a hill, and there it was, a sprawling 2-story structure of weathered wood and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, stables, bunkhouse, and what looked like a cookhouse. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and as they approached, Josephine could see figures moving about, going about the business of the ranch. A woman emerged from the main house as their wagon pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron. She was middle-aged, with graying dark hair pulled back in a bun, and her weathered face split into a wide smile when she saw Jacob. "Mr. Morgan," she called, hurrying down the porch steps. "We were starting to worry, Mrs. Abernathy." Jacob greeted her warmly as he jumped down from the wagon. "No need for concern. I just took a longer route home than expected." He turned to help Josephine down, his hands lingering at her waist. "I've brought a guest. This is Miss Josephine Bennett." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes widened as she took in Josephine's travel-worn appearance, then darted to Jacob with a question in them. "A guest," she repeated. "A friend," Jacob said firmly. "Who will be staying with us for?" "Well, for as long as she likes." Understanding dawned on the older woman's face. "I see," she said, her smile returning as she turned to Josephine. "Well, Miss Bennett, you're most welcome. You must be exhausted after your journey. Let me show you to a room where you can rest and freshen up." "Thank you," Josephine said, suddenly shy in the face of the woman's scrutiny. Jacob squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Go with Mrs. Abernathy. Get settled. I need to speak with Miguel about some ranch business, but I'll see you at dinner." Josephine allowed herself to be led into the house, which was even more impressive inside than out. The entry hall opened into a large living room with a stone fireplace, comfortable-looking furniture, and shelves lined with books. Beyond, she caught glimpses of a dining room and what appeared to be a study. "It's lovely," she said to Mrs. Abernathy as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. "Mr. Morgan has made many improvements since his father's time," the older woman replied, "though he's often said the place needs a woman's touch." She gave Josephine a meaningful look that made her blush. Mrs. Abernathy showed her to a spacious bedroom with its own adjoining bathroom, a luxury Josephine had rarely experienced. "This is the guest room," the housekeeper explained. "But if you're to be staying, well, we can discuss arrangements later." Once alone, Josephine took advantage of the large copper tub, soaking away the dust and fatigue of their journey. Clean clothes had been laid out for her, simple but well-made garments that must have belonged to Mrs. Abernathy or perhaps Elena Ramirez. They were a bit large but manageable, with a belt cinched tight. By the time she descended for dinner, feeling refreshed and more presentable, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows of the dining room. Jacob was waiting for her, freshly bathed and changed himself, his hair still damp at the temples. He rose as she entered, his eyes warming appreciatively. "You look beautiful," he said simply. She smiled, feeling a blush rise in her cheeks. "Clean, at least," she corrected him. "Mrs. Abernathy was kind enough to lend me some clothes. We'll ride into town tomorrow or the next day," he promised. "Get you whatever you need." Dinner was served by a young woman who was introduced as Rosalita, Elena and Miguel's daughter. The food was plentiful and delicious: roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, and bread still warm from the oven. For dessert, there was apple pie with cream. "Mrs. Abernathy's pies are famous throughout the county," Jacob told her as she savored her first bite. "She's won the blue ribbon at the county fair 3 years running." After dinner, they retired to the living room, where Jacob built a small fire to ward off the evening chill. They sat side by side on the sofa, a respectable distance between them but close enough that Josephine could feel the warmth of his presence. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, studying her face in the firelight. "Is there anything else you need?" She shook her head. "Everyone has been so kind. It's almost overwhelming after Verdi." His expression darkened at the mention of the town they'd fled. "Have you thought about what you'd like to do here?" he asked, changing the subject. "As I said, there's no pressure. You can take all the time you need to decide if this is where you want to be." Josephine considered the question carefully. "I'd like to be useful," she said finally. "I'm good with numbers. I kept the books for my father's various enterprises before everything went wrong. And I enjoy cooking, though I'm not nearly as skilled as Mrs. Abernathy. I can sew and garden and—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "I suppose I just want to find my place here." Jacob reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Your place can be whatever you want it to be," he said softly. "But I hope in time it might be at my side." Her breath caught at the directness of his words. "Jacob, we barely know each other." "I know," he acknowledged. "And yet I feel I've known you all my life." "What I said on the train wasn't just words, Josephine. I believe we were meant to find each other." In the flickering firelight, with his blue eyes earnest and unwavering, it was easy to believe him. Easy to imagine a future here, in this beautiful house, with this man who had risked everything to save her. "I think perhaps you're right," she whispered. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Josephine," he murmured against her lips. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Josephine rose early each morning, joining Jacob for breakfast before he headed out to work with the ranch hands. During the day, she explored the house and grounds, getting to know the layout of what she increasingly thought of as her new home. Mrs. Abernathy was a font of information about the ranch and its history, sharing stories of Jacob's boyhood and his father's struggles to build the place into what it was today. Elena Ramirez, a quiet, dignified woman with a ready smile, taught her about the kitchen garden and introduced her to the chickens that provided eggs for the household in the evenings. Jacob returned, often dusty and tired but always with a smile for her. They would dine together, sometimes joined by Miguel or other members of the household, and afterward would sit in the living room or on the porch, talking until late into the night. Jacob was a good listener, genuinely interested in her stories of growing up as the only child of a restless dreamer like Thomas Bennett. In turn, he shared more about his own life, his mother's early death, his father's dedication to the ranch, his own brief time at university before returning to take over when his father's health began to fail. "I always thought I'd see more of the world," he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "Paris, London, New York. But somehow the ranch always needed me, and then my father got sick and—" He shrugged. "Life happens while you're making other plans, I suppose. Do you regret it?" she asked. Staying, he considered the question, then shook his head. "No, this land gets in your blood. It's part of who I am now." He looked at her, his expression softening. "And if I'd gone wandering the world, I might never have found you." It was moments like these quiet, intimate conversations where they revealed pieces of themselves to each other that Josephine felt their connection deepening into something more than the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. A week after their arrival, Jacob took her into town as promised. Oak Ridge was larger than Verdi, with a proper main street lined with shops, a small hotel, a church, and even a theater that showed moving pictures once a month. "This is where we do most of our trading," Jacob explained as they walked arm in arm down the boardwalk. "The ranch is largely self-sufficient, but there are always things we need from town." They visited the general store, where Jacob insisted on purchasing everything Josephine might need: dresses, undergarments, toiletries, even books from the small selection near the back of the store. When she protested the expense, he simply smiled and said, "Consider it a welcome gift." At the dressmaker's shop, he arranged for several custom-made garments, day dresses, a riding habit, and even a ball gown, though Josephine couldn't imagine when she'd wear such a thing. "The County Harvest Festival is in a few months," he explained. "There's always a dance. I'd like to take you if you're willing." The idea of being on his arm at a public event acknowledged as his. What? His companion? His intended? The question hung unspoken between them, adding a layer of anticipation to their interactions. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon for the return journey, Jacob paused, his expression growing more serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. "About your legal situation." Josephine tensed. "What about it?" "The papers those men signed in Verdi," he said. "They're legally binding as far as they go. But I've been thinking it might be wise to have a proper lawyer look them over, make sure everything is in order, and perhaps consider other legal arrangements for your protection." She understood what he wasn't saying. "You mean marriage," she said bluntly. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Not necessarily right away," he clarified, "but it would provide you with certain protections under the law, security if anything were to happen to me." "Is this a proposal, Jacob Morgan?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the conversation. He took her hands in his. "Not the one you deserve," he said earnestly. "When I properly propose, it will be because we both want it, not because it's practical or expedient." Her heart warmed at his words. "And what if I told you I might already want it?" she asked softly, his eyes darkened. Then I'd say I'm the luckiest man in California. He brushed his thumb across her cheek. But I still want to do this right, court you properly like you deserve. The month that followed was the happiest of Josephine's life. True to his word, Jacob courted her with a gentle persistence that made her feel cherished and desired. There were picnics by the stream that ran through the property, horseback rides across the rolling pastures, and quiet evenings by the fire where he read to her from his favorite books. Physical affection between them increased gradually, from brief kisses to longer, more passionate embraces that left them both breathless. Jacob was always careful to stop before things went too far, mindful of her reputation and his own promises to do things properly. During this time, Josephine found her place within the household routine. She took over the management of the house accounts from Mrs. Abernathy, who was more than happy to relinquish the task. She helped Alina with the kitchen garden, learning about the various herbs and vegetables that thrived in the California soil. And she began riding out with Jacob occasionally to learn more about the ranch operations. "You're a natural on horseback," he told her one afternoon as they rode back from checking on a herd of cattle in the north pasture. "Much better than I was when I started." She laughed, patting the neck of the gentle mare he had given her as a gift. "Mabel does most of the work," she demurred. "I just try to stay out of her way." Jacob's smile was warm as he watched her. "You've changed since we arrived," he observed. "You seem lighter." "I feel lighter," she admitted, "as if a weight has been lifted." She hesitated, then added, "Being here with you, it's healing something I didn't even know was broken." That evening, after dinner, Jacob led her out onto the porch where they had spent so many evenings talking. But tonight was different. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with something in his pocket as they sat on the swing. "Josephine," he began, then stopped, cleared his throat, and started again. "Josephine, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Having you here, seeing you every day, getting to know you. It's confirmed what I suspected from the moment we met. You're the woman I've been waiting for all my life." Her heart began to race as he slid off the swing and dropped to one knee before her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I know it hasn't been long," he continued, "and if you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Josephine Bennett. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you hum when you're working. I love how you always stop to pet the barn cats, even when you're in a hurry. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much." He opened the box, revealing a beautiful sapphire ring surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the man kneeling before her, this good, honorable man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a passion that made her cling to him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Oak Ridge. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, attended by the entire ranch household and several neighbors and friends from town. Josephine wore a cream-colored gown that the dressmaker had created in record time, and Jacob was resplendent in a new suit ordered from Sacramento. Mrs. Abernathy cried openly throughout the ceremony, while Alina and Miguel beamed from the front pew, clearly approving of their employer's choice of bride. Even the ranch hands dressed in their Sunday best, looking somewhat uncomfortable in their stiff collars but genuinely happy for their boss. The celebration afterward, held at the ranch, lasted well into the night. There was dancing in the courtyard, with lanterns strung overhead and Miguel's brother providing music with his fiddle. Jacob barely let Josephine out of his sight, introducing her proudly to everyone as my wife, with a joy that was infectious. When the last guest had departed and the household had retired, Jacob led Josephine, now officially Mrs. Morgan, up the stairs to the master bedroom, which had been freshly painted and decorated for her arrival as his wife. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morgan," he said softly, closing the door behind them. That night, they consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that brought tears to Josephine's eyes. In Jacob's arms, she found not just physical pleasure but a deep sense of belonging, of coming home after a long journey. As they lay together afterward, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, Josephine thought about the strange, winding path that had brought her here, from the frightened, desperate woman in Verdi to the contented bride in this beautiful room. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. She smiled against his skin. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best ones," she said. "If my father hadn't been such a terrible gambler, if he hadn't died when he did, if those men hadn't tried to claim me." "If I hadn't been looking for your father," Jacob added, understanding her train of thought. "If I hadn't arrived in Verdi on that exact day at that exact moment, we might never have found each other," she finished. He tightened his arms around her. "Then I'm grateful for all of it," he said fiercely. "Every twist of fate that brought you to me." The years that followed were kind to the Morgans. Under their joint management, the ranch flourished, expanding to include additional acreage and a growing herd of prize cattle. Jacob's innovative breeding programs and farming techniques earned recognition throughout the state, while Josephine's careful management of the household and accounts ensured their prosperity. Their first child, a son they named Thomas Jacob Morgan after both their fathers, though Jacob sometimes joked that his middle name would be the one they used, was born a little over a year after their wedding. He was a sturdy, blue-eyed boy with his father's determined chin and his mother's gentle smile. When he was 3, Thomas was joined by twin sisters, Emma and Sarah, who kept the entire household on their toes with their mischievous antics and contagious laughter. Josephine took to motherhood with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, while Jacob proved to be an adoring, if sometimes bemused, father to his growing brood. Life wasn't always easy. There were droughts that threatened the herds, economic downturns that made money tight, and the normal challenges of maintaining a large ranch and raising a family. But through it all, Jacob and Josephine's partnership remained strong, their love deepening with each passing year. They never did hear from the 3 surviving men from Verdi again. Occasionally, travelers would bring news of the town, which had eventually rebuilt after the fire but never quite recovered its former prosperity. Vernon Stokes's death had been ruled self-defense, just as Jacob had predicted, and no charges were ever filed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Josephine with a trip to San Francisco, leaving the children in the capable care of Mrs. Abernathy and Alina. It was the first time she had seen the ocean, and she stood on the beach, hair whipping in the wind, overcome by the vastness of it. "It's magnificent," she breathed as Jacob wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Not half as magnificent as you," he said, nuzzling her neck. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" She leaned back against his solid warmth. "Only 3 times since breakfast," she teased. "You're slipping." He laughed, turning her in his arms to face him. 10 years, he marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday we met on that dusty street in Verdi. Other times, it feels like you've always been part of my life." "The best part, I hope," she said, reaching up to touch his face, still handsome though now with strands of silver at his temples. "The very best," he confirmed, bending to kiss her with a passion undiminished by time or familiarity. Later that night, as they lay in their hotel bed, Josephine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. From a desperate young woman with no options to a beloved wife and mother, respected in her community and secure in her place in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, echoing the question he'd asked on their wedding night and countless times since. She smiled, snuggling closer to him. "About how sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best ones," she said. "About how 4 men once tried to claim me as payment for a debt, but you saw me not as property but as a person, as free." Jacob's arms tightened around her. "The best decision I ever made," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Standing up for you that day." "And the best decision I ever made was trusting you," she replied, "coming with you when you asked." They were silent for a moment, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, before Jacob spoke again. "You know, I set out to find your father seeking justice, or maybe revenge. I thought it would bring me some kind of closure for my own father's pain. But what I found instead was so much more valuable." "What was that?" she asked, though she knew the answer. His smile was tender in the darkness. "A future," he said simply. "A love that healed old wounds and made new beginnings possible. A family that fills my heart in ways I never imagined possible." Josephine kissed him softly. "For me too," she whispered. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved, Jacob Morgan." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "And we'll keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." It was a promise they both kept, through all the joys and sorrows that the years brought their way. Their children grew, the ranch prospered, and their love remained the steady center around which their world revolved. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when they sat together on the porch swing watching the sunset, Josephine would look at her husband and remember that fateful day in Verdi when 4 men tried to claim her as payment for a debt. And a cowboy said, "She's not property, she's free." It had been the beginning of everything that mattered.